What exactly is critical race theory? Can you give us a more descriptive definition?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, and I'll try to make it not super academic, but it is an academic framework. So that's the first thing, which is why it's not even necessary in this conversation that we're having right now around schools. So when you really, let me start from the kind of its founding. So we all know about the Civil Rights Act, that passed in '64 that really made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race and other protected identities. And so prior to '64, racism and racial ideologies, racial inequities, they were legal. It was legal. The law supported your ability to discriminate against people based off of race. Well, in '64, that went away. But I know we all know that just because a law came into play doesn't mean the ideologies, the thoughts, the perspectives, the values of the country shifted all of a sudden with the signing of a bill or an act.
Mhm.
And so what we recognized after '64 in the civil rights movement, as we all know, is there were still inequities. There were gender
Mhm.
inequities, there were racial inequities, there were inequities around, sexual identities, who had access to be married, all that stuff, things that we are still fighting for now. And so there was a need to be able to interrogate and analyze systems and institutions, policies, laws through the lens of centering historically marginalized identities and backgrounds. And so the term folks used back then, minorities, we don't really use that term as much now. But and so critical race theory really came about in the '70s post the civil rights movement as a tool to continue effort to build inclusion and justice, where it came from critical legal studies, really, it started in law. And it really came to help practitioners and scholars in law really analyze the impact of various laws that were now being deemed colorblind, that now that it was not legal to discriminate, everyone had access. Critical race theory created a framework and really lifted up the narratives of people of color to be able to talk about, particularly Black people initially, to really talk about and to share experiences and to collect data based off racialized experiences. Thing about CRT that's interesting is it like there's a whole bunch of iterations. Like there's Lat Crit, which is around the Latina experience. There's critical queer theory. There's queer theory. There's a lot of different iterations of similar frameworks. And so all it really is, I usually wear glasses when I don't have my contacts in, but I always tell folks it's a lens to how you understand things. It's a framework.
Yeah.
It's
Mm.
how you analyze. And it is only technically a curriculum for folks who are in school, graduate school, usually or law school, who want to critique or create a critical lens of how we understand something.
Okay. Okay.
So, how are you connected to critical race theory?
Yeah, I feel like I eat, breathe, and sleep critical race theory these days. That's I think that has to do with a lot of the discourse that's going on. My first interaction with CRT, and one thing I would say, if there's a lot of books around critical race theory. I'm a show and tell type of person, so
Okay.
here's one of the manuals. You can see how thick it is. Some of the founders of CRT, I want to make sure I lift some of them up: Derek Bell, um, Gene Stefanik, Gloria Lanson Billings, Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw, who also created intersectionality, which you've probably heard about before as far as identities are concerned. And so I first, one big tenet of critical race theory is counter narratives or storytelling, that people of culture who come from historically underrepresented cultures pass down history, share knowledge, create transformation through storytelling and narratives. And quickly, I was in my first, it was 2 days before I started my PhD program at the University of Georgia. I was 25 at the time. I had went to an HBCU prior to, so I already dealt with a little bit of stereotype threat and about not belonging and feeling like I wasn't smart enough and, going to, school like Georgia. And I was driving down the street I found a Black barbershop in Athens, Georgia. And I was driving down the street to get to the barbershop. It was around rush hour. Um, and, small town rush hour, not like Atlanta, DC rush hour, but just traffic.
There were four cars.
You said,
You
you
know,
said
5 cars. That was, there's no real highway, but it was traffic for me. Look, that's how I was traffic. It was rush hour. And I tried to get over in a lane, and a guy and a white dude in a dirty pickup truck, I guess, got upset that I tried to get over, and he said, "What the F are you doing, you effing in?" And it took me aback because I was like, I hadn't experienced this before. And I'm like, how am I supposed to kind of get my mind around now being the only Black male in my PhD program at the time, at a school that has had a very sordid history with diversity and integration. Georgia wasn't integrated to the 60s. My parents were born before, right around the time that Georgia was integrated, which is ridiculous. That's not that long. And so I really wanted a framework to understand how I could help make change. And so I took some qualitative research classes. And so I started to take classes in it. And I started to conduct research. My dissertation, I studied racism for Black men on predominantly white campuses, was the first large study that I did on critical race, using a critical race theory framework and then using it as a way to collect data, which is just kind of storytelling. And I used pictures for the guys to tell me about how they experience racism. And then all of my work academically and even in the advocacy space has been centered in race. So it's been how I pay my bills. It's been how I try to lead change. And part of what I try to do is also have these type of conversations to bring other people into the critical race sphere, because it's not that it's not as scary as it's not as intellectualized as I think we're hearing about it on. So I hope this conversation makes other folks want to get a little bit more involved in how they can engage in the CRT work too.
Yeah.
Jamie, can you speak to the original body of critical race theory and how it's trickled down into the philosophy of education and school pedagogy and administration?
Yeah, so it really started in law. Again, it was really how, and I guess the best way to kind of give some examples of that is to really talk about how CRT, why it was necessary. And so if you look through, it started in law. So if you look at redlining, we all kind of heard of redlining, where there's a devalue of homes in Black neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Administration in 1934 refused to insure mortgages for near African-American neighborhoods, which was called redlining. At the same time, the FHA, Fair Housing Administration, subsidized builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions for whites with the requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. And so you've got a whole national administration, a governmental administration that has built-in racialized segregation and discriminatory practices. CRT allows us to antagonize that and talk about where, the why, the how, and how to address it. If you look at the New Deal in 1933, domestic care workers were left out of the benefits of the New Deal. They're saying the Build Back Better agenda is kind of like the New Deal. It's going to expand social safety net and public benefit programs. So the New Deal left domestic care workers out. Well, at that point in time, most domestic care workers were Black women during that time. So Black women, Black families at that time did not benefit from any of the public benefit programs, hence weren't able to build generational wealth, remained in poverty. And so again, race was centered in how we understood that. If you look at many of the other public programs, if you look at like SNAP and TANF and the idea that many of the programs require work requirements, family caps, drug testing. Even if you're hearing Manchin right now talk about the child tax credit, he's talked about means testing. Those are all buzzwords for racialized ideologies on how low-income people of color, mostly Black people, will make use or take advantage of public programs. And so critical race theory really gave scholars the language to interrogate laws and policies. What folks realized after that was, well, there are other institutions as well that have had some of these same practices. And so it really moved into education because, again, we looked at funding for schools. We looked at how schools were based off local taxes and incomes of the people in those areas. We looked at, the ideas of charter schools and their role. And so it really, and Gloria Ladson Billings is one of the ones who really kind of opened up the education conversation. On the K-12 space, it took off more about understanding the institution and system of education, not teaching students critical race theory. It was more about how do you create a pedagogical approach, or a curricular approach, curriculum, in other words, approach for students that addresses all the institutional inequities in race, not specifically what you're saying in the classroom or the content, but how you're thinking about education. And it's also moved to the higher ed space as well, as you think about climate retention, attrition rates as well. And so, again, started in law, moved to education, and it's been used widely in health. It's been used as you think about other institutions, but it's most popular for education and law, given that they kind of, they have institutional inequities built into them, and there's policies that wrap around them.